The first shot was the flicker of firelight cutting through the night's stillness. The barn doors swung open with a groan, and for the briefest moment, the wind stilled as if holding its breath. Inside, a figure was crouched, half hidden beneath haystacks and shadows. A girl, no older than 16, if that, her face a mess of dirt, blood, and raw determination. Her hands were bound, wrists raw and red from struggle, and in the flickering light of his lantern, a single tear clung to her cheek before it vanished into the dirt below. Joe Anderson hesitated at the door, lantern in hand. His heart pounded, and for a fleeting second, he thought about turning around. It wasn't the first time his night had been disturbed, but this was different. The figure in front of him wasn't just another stray who had found shelter. She was something more, something dangerous. Yet there she sat, staring up at him, her eyes wild and desperate. "Help me!" she rasped, barely a whisper, but it carried with it the weight of a plea that could undo him. His boots shifted, heavy against the creaky floor. The pain in her eyes tore through him like a bullet. He could have walked away. The town was full of rumors about her, how she'd gone mad after her father was hanged. How the ranch she'd inherited had turned to dust under her hands. How no one trusted her. Yet here she was, waiting in his barn, the very place he thought was a sanctuary from the chaos outside. Joe didn't say a word. Instead, he stepped forward, his lantern casting long shadows on the floor. He lowered it to the ground, the dim light revealing something that froze him cold, a crude brand on her wrist. A mark he'd buried, forgotten years ago. He took a step back. The brand was unmistakable. The same as the one he bore. The same as the one that had haunted him for decades. He could hear his heart pounding in his chest as he looked at her, her tear-streaked face, the rawness of her pain. Was she truly the wild creature they said she was, or was this something darker, something much worse? "Who did this to you?" Joe finally asked, his voice hoarse, fighting against the cold knot in his throat. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, in the quietest voice, barely audible over the wind outside, she spoke. "Your name is on my father's death warrant. You killed him!" The words hit Joe like a sudden gust of wind, cold and unforgiving. His fingers clenched around the lantern, the metal biting into his palm. For a moment, his breath was shallow, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. "You're wrong," he finally muttered, but the words didn't feel right, not at all. They sounded hollow even to him. He stepped back, his boots scraping against the floor as the full weight of her accusation sank in. She didn't speak again. Her eyes, wide and glassy with pain, stayed locked on his. In the dim light, he could see the flickering of her thoughts. She was calculating every breath, every movement, every moment of silence. Waiting for him to say something more. Something that would confirm her suspicions. Joe swallowed hard. She was young, too young to remember what had really happened. The events that had led to her father's death were buried beneath a mountain of lies and half-truths, but he knew how people worked. The world only saw what it wanted to see. And right now, it saw a girl with a mark that tied her to him. He had always been careful. Always hidden from the truth of his past. The brand on her wrist wasn't just some coincidence. It was proof that she wasn't just some lost soul wandering the West, but someone connected to the very blood he thought he'd washed from his hands long ago. "I didn't kill your father," Joe said again, his voice steadier now, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "But I know who did." Her face twisted in anger. "You don't get to say that," she hissed. "You don't get to lie to me anymore." She tried to stand, but the pain in her legs forced her to crumble back to the hay. Joe's instincts screamed at him to run, to leave her there and forget this ever happened. But he couldn't. Not now. He had lived too long hiding from the past. The girl before him was the key to everything. The tension in the barn thickened, suffocating. The wind outside was howling, but the only thing Joe could hear now was the rapid beat of his own heart. His mind raced, torn between what was right and what was safe. Could he really tell her the truth? Would it make any difference at all? Or would it just get them both killed? He took another step closer to her. Who's after you? He asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. She paused, considering his question, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Then, without warning, she glanced over her shoulder toward the barn door, as if sensing something, or someone, out there in the dark. They'd been tracking me for days, she said, her voice tight. They know about you. They know about everything. A slow realization dawned on Jo. It wasn't just her father's death she was running from. It was everything. The people after her weren't just outlaws. They were something far worse, far more dangerous. Before Jo could respond, the sound of hooves echoed through the night, distant at first, but growing louder by the second. Someone was coming. The distant thrum of hooves turned into a pounding rhythm that rattled the barn walls. It wasn't just one rider. It was a whole group, the sound of their approach cutting through the stillness like a storm. Joe's hand instinctively went to the revolver at his hip, the cold steel a reminder of how quickly everything could turn to violence. He scanned the dim light of the barn, his gaze darting between the girl and the door, the shadows creeping closer. The girl's breath came in shallow, anxious gasps as she pulled her knees closer to her chest. Her eyes flickered toward the barn door, her body tense as a coiled spring. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said it all. She was terrified. And she wasn't alone in that fear. Joe took a step forward, his voice low and steady. You need to stay down. Don't move unless I say so. She nodded, though her face was pale with terror. Joe didn't want to leave her like this. He wanted to reach out, to give her some kind of comfort, but he knew better. In this world, comfort got people killed. He had learned that the hard way. The sound of the riders grew louder, closer, until the barn door shuddered under their weight. Joe's pulse quickened. He knew what they were here for, and it wasn't her. Not really. It was him. The door burst open with a crash. The night air flooded in, followed by the harsh, cruel voices of men who had no patience for hesitation. You hiding a wild one in there, Joe? The voice came from the front of the barn, rough and familiar. Frank Callahan. The man Joe had once called a friend. Joe's heart stilled. He couldn't let himself show weakness, not now. He stepped into the shadows, his hand still on his gun, his mind racing. Frank had been one of the few who knew about his past, about the things he had done. The things he had tried to bury. Frank's boots scraped against the floor as he entered the barn, his silhouette framed by the light outside. Behind him, 2 other men followed, their faces obscured by shadows but their presence unmistakable. They weren't here for conversation. Joe held his breath, his eyes never leaving Frank. The man was looking around, his expression unreadable. He hadn't noticed the girl yet. But that wouldn't last long. You know what happens when you hide someone like that, Joe? Frank said, his voice low but carrying the weight of years of bad blood. It's a death sentence for both of you. Joe's grip tightened on the lantern, the heat from the flame creeping up his hand. He didn't respond. Words were useless now. Then, to his horror, Frank's gaze slid over to the hay where the girl was crouching, and a slow, cruel grin spread across his face. Found her, Frank drawled. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the straw. Looks like she's all tied up, too. What's this, Joe? You running some kind of charity for strays? The girl flinched, but Joe wasn't about to let Frank get any closer. He moved fast. His revolver was in his hand before Frank could take another step. Stay back, Frank, Joe growled, his voice low and dangerous. This doesn't concern you. Frank chuckled, the sound too dark for a man who once had a drink with Joe at the saloon. You're a damn fool, Joe. This always concerns me. You think you can run from your past? You think you can hide out here and play the Good Samaritan? I'm giving you one last chance. Come on out, and you can leave with me. You won't have to answer for her father's death. Not yet, anyway. Joe's heart raced, but his voice stayed calm, steady. Not a chance. Frank's smile faded, his eyes hardening. He could feel the tension building in the air now. The moment had passed the point of no return. There would be no walking away. No escaping the past. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" Frank sneered, his hand brushing against his gun. "Well, let me tell you something, Joe. You ain't saving nobody. You're just digging your grave deeper." The last of the daylight outside flickered through the barn, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and grow, mirroring the slow but inevitable pull of the past closing in on Joe. Before Joe could speak, the silence shattered. The girl, her eyes wide with panic, whispered, "He's one of them, isn't he? He's the one who—" But she never finished her sentence. Outside, a shout broke through the night, a single word that sent a jolt of recognition through Joe's chest. "Move out!" A horn sounded. More men. More danger. The shout rang out, shattering the air with a deafening crack. The girl yelped, flinching as she threw herself deeper into the hay. Joe's hand was already on his revolver, his instincts sharp and ready, but his mind raced. Frank's men weren't the only threat. The group outside, the ones with the horn, were closing in fast. Every second that passed meant more danger. He couldn't let this go on any longer. Frank's men began to scatter, ducking behind the barn's wooden beams, drawing their own guns. The sound of footsteps pounding the dirt outside grew louder as the enemy closed in. Joe knew he didn't have much time. His first instinct was to fight, to end this with the cold precision he'd spent years perfecting. But his thoughts kept flickering back to the girl, to her wide eyes and trembling form in the hay. She had been through too much. Too much pain. Too much fear. And right now, she needed something that Joe hadn't been able to give anyone in years, a moment of peace. Without thinking, Joe crouched low and approached her, his revolver still in hand, every sense on alert. His heart hammered in his chest, but as he knelt beside her, he saw the fear in her eyes. Not just the fear of death, but the fear of being abandoned again. He could see it now, more clearly than he had before. The girl had no one. She'd been running for days, hiding from people who had no intention of letting her go. And now, even in the middle of this chaos, she was looking at him as though he could fix everything, as though he could make it stop. Joe reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, trying to steady his own shaking hand. "You're not alone," he said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. It was almost a confession to himself as much as it was to her. "I'll get you out of here." She didn't respond immediately, her lips trembling, her eyes searching his face as if looking for the truth in the storm that surrounded them. Finally, after a long beat, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to do anymore. I thought you were like the rest of them." The words hung in the air, a painful truth that neither of them could escape. Joe had been like the rest of them once. Cold, ruthless. A man driven by a need for survival. But something in her eyes made him see that he couldn't be that man again. Not for her. Not for anyone. Joe's eyes darted to the door, his mind calculating. He had only one shot at getting them both out alive, and it wasn't going to be easy. But the girl. She deserved better than this. She deserved a chance to run, to live. Before he could say anything else, another gunshot rang out. This time it wasn't a warning. A bullet grazed the edge of the barn, sending splinters flying. Frank had made his move. Joe didn't waste any more time. His eyes locked onto the girl's, his hand hovering for a moment over the bindings on her wrists. "Stay low," he whispered, and without waiting for an answer, he untied her. She winced as the ropes fell away, but there was no time to comfort her. As soon as she was free, Joe turned and motioned for her to follow him, leading her toward the back of the barn, where the sound of the riders outside grew louder. The moonlight barely penetrated the cracks in the walls, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The barn felt like a tomb, the air thick with the scent of dust and hay, and the palpable weight of everything that was about to happen. Joe heard the girl's breath catch behind him as she stumbled to keep up. She was exhausted, bruised, and scared, but she was still alive. And that was more than Joe had expected when he first found her. "Keep up," Joe muttered, his voice low, his mind sharp with the instinct to survive. The enemy was out there, closing in. The sounds of hooves, of men shouting, of the world about to collapse in on itself. But in this moment, it was just the two of them, moving together, one step after another, against everything that wanted to tear them apart. When they reached the back of the barn, Joe motioned to the small, weathered door that led out into the open. The night air beyond was still, as if waiting, holding its breath for what was to come. But then, before they could make it, a voice called out. "Don't even think about it, Joe." Joe's heart sank. He recognized the voice, deep, gravelly, and full of malice. It was Frank. Joe glanced at the girl. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. He could see her hands trembling, but she was still standing, still fighting. He reached for his gun, but just as his fingers brushed the handle, he heard Frank's voice again, this time closer. "I gave you a chance, Joe. You and her. Now you'll both pay the price." The sound of footsteps grew closer. They were running out of time. The barn door slammed open with a crack, and the shadow of Frank Callahan's figure loomed in the doorway. His gun was drawn, his face hard with the kind of certainty only years of violence could bring. Behind him, the other riders closed in, their faces grim, set in a silent pact to end this here, to put an end to whatever hope Joe had left. Joe didn't hesitate. His hand was steady now, the revolver's cold weight familiar, comforting. He wasn't the man who had fled the past anymore. He was something else. Something that had been forged in the flames of regret, hardened by loss, and tempered by the sharp edge of survival. But the girl, her breath was shallow, her eyes wide with a desperate kind of fear that Joe knew too well. He could feel the weight of her trust on his shoulders, and for the first time in years, it was something he didn't want to lose. He turned to her, his voice low. "Stay down. I'll get us out of here." She nodded, but the look in her eyes told him that she wasn't sure if she believed him. Frank's voice broke through the stillness, thick with mockery. "You really think you can take us all on, Joe?" Frank stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dirt. "I gave you a chance, but now you're nothing more than a dead man walking." Joe's pulse quickened. He wasn't afraid of Frank. He wasn't afraid of any of them. But the girl was still behind him, her fate tangled with his own. The stakes had never been higher. The first shot came too fast. Frank's men opened fire, the sound of gunshots filling the air, but Joe was ready. His hand moved like lightning, and the first man dropped to the ground with a muffled thud. The second shot rang out just as quickly, and another man fell. The remaining riders hesitated, just long enough for Joe to duck behind a haystack, pulling the girl with him. She was gasping for breath, the weight of the moment sinking into her. But she wasn't screaming. She wasn't cowering. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a silent understanding between them. She wasn't just some lost soul anymore. She was a fighter. And Joe wasn't going to let her die tonight. The world outside seemed to hold its breath as the gunfight raged on. Joe knew they couldn't stay here. The barn wasn't going to be enough to protect them forever. Frank would keep coming until there was nothing left to fight for. But Joe had one last trick up his sleeve. He looked at the girl again, his face grim, his voice steady. "Stay low. Follow my lead." She didn't argue. She just nodded, clutching the hem of his coat like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Joe moved slowly, making his way to the back of the barn. He knew Frank would be coming around the other side, thinking they were cornered. The last of the riders were distracted, trying to reload and regroup, and Joe made his move. In one swift motion, he grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her to the side door. The world outside was still dark, but now there was a path, a small chance to escape. They were just about to step out when Frank's voice rang out, loud and furious. "You're not going anywhere, Joe!" The words were a death sentence. But it wasn't Frank who fired the next shot. The crack of gunfire echoed through the night, but it wasn't aimed at Joe. It hit Frank square in the chest. He dropped like a stone, his body crumpling in the doorway. Behind him stood a figure, silhouetted by the moonlight, a man Joe knew all too well. His hand was still smoking from the shot, his face unreadable as he lowered his revolver. "You didn't think I'd let you kill him, did you?" The voice was calm, cold. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly what it meant to live with regret, to face the ghosts of the past. It was Nathan Cole, an old acquaintance of Joe's, someone from a time when Joe's past had been nothing but blood and violence. The tension in the barn seemed to dissolve in an instant. Frank's men were frozen, eyes wide with fear. Nathan stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Joe. "You're a lucky man, Joe. But you're still a damn fool." Joe's heart was pounding, but the weight of the world lifted just slightly. He had one chance to make this right. Nathan didn't wait for a response. He moved toward the girl, nodding at her with the faintest hint of respect. "Get out of here. Both of you." Joe didn't hesitate. He grabbed the girl's hand once more and led her through the door, his heart still hammering in his chest. The sound of the remaining riders' boots on the dirt faded behind them, but Joe didn't dare look back. Not yet. Years later, the girl, now a woman, would sit on a porch in a small cabin on the edge of nowhere, the sky a vivid shade of orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. She would remember the way Joe had kissed her forehead that night, the way his voice had been the only thing steady in a world gone mad. "You're worth saving," he had told her. And as she watched the sunset, she knew that, somehow, he had saved them both. The wind kicked up, whispering through the trees. The rocking chair on the porch creaked softly, but it wasn't just the wind she heard. It was the sound of a life rebuilt from the ashes. The door creaked open, and she didn't need to look to know who was there. He had kept his promise. The last shot lingered, not in the gunfire or the fight, but in the soft glow of the evening light as Joe stepped out of the shadows, his figure framed by the doorway. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. The screen fades to black.